We're going to start. Thanks, guys, for coming for this fifth Nexus. Please feel yourself at home. We have somehow a bar as well in the back if you want a beer or something. We're going to be selling beers as well. My name is Sanchez. I've been organizing this event in the past 5 instances. I teach here in the Bartlett. We're trying to kind of bring together different disciplines, both architecture, design, digital media, artists, and musicians. And in a way, start really looking at what they're doing. People that are very close to the work with their hands, and they're kind of struggling, some of them to kind of emerge into practice, and some of them just already kind of having amazing practices going on. We have today Ollie Palmer from the Bartlett, money around the world, from Arab, and also teaching here in Bartlett. We have Vera from Field. Marcus couldn't join us today. And also Memo Atken, who has this amazing practice as well, and looking forward to see some of the recent work. Again, if you feel like just asking some questions, we're going to have a roundtable at the end that's going to be joined by Molly Claypool as well, one of the tutors here. And open mic, if you really want to just join the conversation, feel free. We're going to keep it informal. So thanks for coming in.
Thanks for the introduction. Hi, I'm Ollie Palmer. I teach at Bartlett sometimes, and I'm just going to show you some of the work that I do. So, in the background, I've got this film playing, which I always like to start off with. It's called Phase 4, and it's possibly my favourite ant sci-fi film. There's a whole subgenre of sci-fi films just about ants, and this is probably the best. But my project is very much kind of based around the idea of Phase 4. Phase 4 is this film where ants take over the whole of the world. It's very kind of 70s, it's quite idealistic. But it's also really beautiful. It's shot by the same guy who shot most of Kubrick's opening scenes, a guy called Sal Bass. But yeah, so this is, my project is split into 4 phases, and that's why there's a kind of phase 4 just at the beginning. So it's called Ant Ballet. My interest is really in control systems, and this is an old William Blake picture of kind of God as an architect, and kind of in an architecture college, this is often the feeling that you get that architects have about themselves, that we kind of look down from on high. We're very used to these kind of hierarchical control systems, and it's very much kind of within our Western mindset that there's always something at the top which is controlling whatever's going on. And Stanley Kubrick looks at a lot of this kind of stuff. He investigates what happens when control systems break down. So in 2001, A Space Odyssey, you have, I hope everyone's seen it, there's a computer on board a ship called HAL, and HAL is in absolute control of everything that goes on board this ship. At some stage, HAL suffers from a logical error and starts killing everybody on board, and the whole thing kind of breaks down, the communication inside HAL breaks down, and he kills everyone. Also, in another Kubrick film, Dr. Strangelove, it's another investigation of what happens when kind of control systems break down. It's an investigation of kind of the whole war system that operated in the 60s. In the film, an errant US Air Force base commander starts a nuclear war inadvertently with Russia, and it spends about 90 minutes just trying to kind of decode what's happened. And the machine is just so well oiled that nothing can actually kind of bring it around to be right. But what's really nice about this the whole room that the film takes place in is called the War Room, and it was designed by a Bartlett graduate called Ken Adams, who graduated in the 40s. But they have this really nice kind of big, powerful light on top of the table. And you can see these people kind of gathered round, and they try to unpick exactly how to stop a nuclear bomb going off. But that leads me on to kind of RAND Corporation stuff. I'm really, anyway, I'm going to skip a lot of this stuff because I realise I've only got 15 minutes, and this is normally kind of a 45-minute presentation. One of the things that I really like is game theory. Game theory is kind of one of these things that came out of pure mathematics laboratories, and really just powerful thought experiments that then became implemented in actual national policy. The idea is that it's the psychology of playing a game against somebody else and how they would react in reaction to your moves. And this works very well when you're playing a game of chess or something like that, but when you translate it to the real world, there's a lot more kind of noise in there. But what's funny is this kind of purely clinical game theory stuff. In the kind of 60s, well, from the 40s to the 90s, the whole era of the Cold War became this kind of game for the world. And there was very much this kind of East versus West mentality going on, and a lot of actual national policy decisions and huge architectural projects and things like the space race were dictated by stuff like game theory. And I think that's kind of absurd because it's this very kind of clinical, structured set of scenarios that you're kind of battling, you're playing within. One of the most interesting ones is this one called line chess. The idea is that you can play a chess game against somebody else without seeing them move their pieces. And it was originally played by Prussian emperors kind of in the 1800s. But then it became kind of a central part of Randian policy in the 60s and actually went on to influence a lot of paranoia in that era. But that's quite interesting because it's kind of this clinical thing that takes place within very tight confines that has then been taken to a ridiculous place. My other main interest is theatre of the absurd. So plays like Beckett's Waiting for Godot, where you get this feeling that every single character is kind of being controlled by a higher power from somewhere else, and that nobody's properly in control. So to contrast that, I look a lot at ants. And this is the traditional kind of view of ants. So they see what they want, somebody's in command, they go up to the front, they bugle, they get all the other ants to go up and steal the dog's steak. And what's funny is this cartoon was made in the 1950s before a lot of cybernetic theory had come to light. And pretty much everything you can see in this film is completely wrong. Not just the dog wearing the hat and kind of falling into the swimming pool and all that stuff, but all the stuff about ants. Ants, as a general rule of thumb, don't have a centralized leader. So ants rely very much on pheromone systems to communicate. And pheromone systems, when you start looking at them, are really interesting. So as an ant walks along, it lays a pheromone to tell other ants what it's thinking via the built environment. So this, on the left, is an alert signal by one ant that has vision, like quite good vision. And as it puts the pheromone down, this is kind of a 1 centimetre, yeah, hang on, let me show you, scared? Yeah, so you have, this ring here is about 8 centimetres across in total, and then the ring in the middle is about 4 centimetres across. And it lays down two chemicals that disperse at different rates. So in the outer ring, the ants come in, other ants get alert and very attentive, and then when they get to the centre ring, they start circling whatever it is they want to attack, and by the time they get to the middle, they can actually see what they are attacking, so they can attack it. Whereas this is an ant that's pretty much completely blind, and you can see its alert signal is a lot larger. And so it lays this, it's about 14 centimetres across this ring. Again, it's chemicals that disperse at different rates. So when the ants enter the outer ring of hexanol, they're alert. Then in the centre, or the next ring, they're attracted. Then in the next ring, they're attracted and they just wander around biting. And by the time they get to the middle, they're just biting because they're going to kill whatever it is they want to bite. But that's quite nice because the ants communicate via just this kind of built environment they have around them. And so I started building simulations of little ants and making them wander around. This is a food simulation. So you can see this kind of ant wandering at the front, and it's laying a little pheromone trail, and the pheromone trail tells other ants that I've got food, I'm a well-fed ant, I really want to share this food with you, follow the trail and you'll find, the mecca of food. And then this next one shows an ant following another ant. So really simple stuff. You can see the pheromone kind of fades over time, the ant wanders along, it steers into it. All of this stuff seems really arbitrary when you do it on a one-to-one ant scale. It's really quite boring. But then when you apply this to kind of hundreds of ants, this is a simulation of 150 ants, sped up, wandering around a table, with about 50% of them fed, about 50% of them unfed. And they start to formulate kind of quite simple paths, but they're quite complex the way they do it. And what's quite nice about this is no individual ant knows what's going on. They don't know they're following this huge trail, they don't know exactly how this is happening, but they know this is the most efficient way to get food. And So the project I'm talking about tonight, Ant Ballet, is an investigation of kind of this hierarchical mode of thought versus this sort of more emergent mode famously ants use, which is where the Ant Ballet comes in. So the idea behind the Ant Ballet is using synthesized versions of ant pheromones to cause ants to do dances that they wouldn't otherwise do. And this is an idea I had when I joined the Bartlett, and it took a few years to actually make work. And this is the process I went through. So the first step was to go and speak to ant experts. This is easier said than done. A lot of scientists are quite isolated. When you do find a really good one, they're really happy to talk, but unless you have a really sound scientific hypothesis, they tell you that something like this is completely impossible, which really didn't fill me with hope. So the second step, after being told that this wasn't possible, was to go and synthesize some pheromones. The first thing you do is obviously look on Google, and Google shows this
now
one.
mastered the reproduction of these synthetic chemicals
into one powerful formula, and now for the first time, it's available to the public. It's called Pherozone.
So that's the first thing that you come across when you look on Google for pheromones, and every time you do a search on Google, it's just impossible to find anything that isn't trying to sell really lonely men sex aids. And all of the stuff that you can buy online, incidentally, is completely unscientifically tested. It makes no sense at all. But it took about a year to find a lab who would make a pheromone for me. We went through a matrix of 184 known species of ants whose pheromones we could dissect, whose pheromones we could identify. We rounded that down to about 6 ants whose trail pheromones included just one chemical, and then just down to one final ant species called Linaphin humar, whose pheromone that we would know would actually have this effect, and we could reproduce. It's a really complex process to actually reproduce chemicals, synthetic pheromones. It took about years to make the Z916 ALD. That is the ant pheromone that I use. And incidentally, this stuff costs $3,700 per gram. It's a really expensive load of chemical. And in total, we made 0.5 grams of this stuff. And this was distributed through kind of 5 kilograms of powder, like this. The powder, as you'll see in a minute, looks it's a fine white powder that I have to take across international borders. And it's really dodgy to actually do that journey. So the third stage of the process is building the Ant Ballet machine. And this is probably the easiest part because it's building machines, which is what people at the Bartlett do. So this is the original kind of concept for the thing. I'm aware I'm a bit over time now, so I'm going to rush through absolutely everything. Here's the original concept for the machine. It's just got 2 kind of spreaders, and it spins around on top of the table. Here it kind of got refined, and it's a robot arm in the middle that draws somehow with pheromones to cause ants. So ants live on this big ring and wander around on this table according to what the pheromone spread is doing. Here's the thing in construction. As I was constructing it, I went to the Metropolitan Police to find out to the forensics department, to find out what they're wearing in the event of an ant outbreak, such as in phase 4. And if there was a terrible kind of ant outbreak along with chemical release, this is exactly the costume they would don. And this is holding a robot arm that does stuff. Here's programming. I've got a feeling that a lot of people in this room will be quite au fait with programming, but the basic idea behind the initial system is that you have an autonomous control system or a mouse input, and you have this kind of GUI that enables you to control where you're spreading powder. That calculates angles and then sends them out to a machine run via Arduino. So, and I showed these slides just to generally show people that it's not that scary building a robot arm. You can do it with, it's about 200 or 300 lines of code. It's really not too complex. And if my computer will let me advance to the next slide. Step 4. Step 4 of the process is probably the hardest part, actually making it work. So before I mentioned about these ants, these are Linaphin humar, these are the ants that I work with. They're the only ants that this pheromone will actually have an effect on. They're called the Argentine ants, and it turns out once I'd gone through the whole process of finding the pheromone and synthesizing it and all that kind of stuff, they're the 3rd most invasive species in the world. So I spoke to DEFRA, the people who tell you whether you're allowed to import ants to the UK or not. Well, import pretty much anything to the UK or not. And they said categorically no. They'd issue me with a £140,000 fine per ant that escaped if there was an error. So the reason that they're so aggressive is because they suffer from, or they have this evolutionary advantage over normal ants. So the normal ants in your back garden will be different from a different colony to the normal ants kind of in your neighbour's back garden. So the two species of Lasius niger, they come from different queens, even though they're the same species. And if they bump into each other, they'll tap each other on the head, and they'll see that they have different hydrocarbons. And because they're from different queens, and they recognise that they're from a different place, and they'll kill each other. These ants don't do that. These ants kind of just get on with any other ant from the same species. So they form these things called supercolonies. And the largest one that we know of, they originally come from Argentina, which is down in South America, and thanks to the wonders of human transport, boats and planes and that kind of thing, they spread across to Europe and, in fact, a lot of the world. And the biggest colony we know of kind of stretches down from this northwest tip of Spain here, right the way around Portugal, the whole way through the south of Spain, and then also through the south of France and Monaco and everything around there, and then right the way down to the middle of Italy. So it's 6,000 kilometres long, and it's one just huge super colony of ants, which is exactly why you're not allowed to bring them to the UK. So after I built this whole machine and synthesised all these pheromones and contacted all these people, it turns out I had to put it all into the back of a Volkswagen Polo and drive down to Barcelona to actually do any testing at all. So here's the place, it's called La Floresta in Barcelona. Here's the machine set up in the middle of the forest. Here's my get out of jail free card for having powder, which looks exactly like cocaine, which just says, I confirm that Leobardo is a master student at UCL who's doing important experimental work. And here's a guy I met in Barcelona who, really fortunately, I managed to go and meet the guy who is probably the world's leading expert on this species of ant. He's been working with them for about 30 years, and he really cares about them. He knows pretty much everything there is to know. He's one of the people who proved that this super colony is huge. He's called Xavier Spander, and you can see him here kind of showing me exactly how you collect ants. And the way you collect ants is through this kind of device, which is it's made with a bit of Perspex tube and a woman's sock and a couple of bits of cork, and you suck up all these ants. And one of the ways you identify the ants in the first place is by crushing them and then smelling them. They have this really distinctive, really disgusting smell. And after about 5 days of sucking these ants up, you just cannot get that smell out of your mouth. It's horrible. So we went out and we collected about 14,000 ants. And here they are. But also, this is so the machine's set up here in the middle of the forest in Barcelona in August. Nobody in Spain does any work in August if it's any kind of manual thing, because it's just too hot to work. And having done it, I can see exactly why. It was really horrible. We were set up in this thing, and the whole idea is that it's kind of this machine runs at night, and you cause the ants to dance, and it's all quite sinister with this kind of Doctor Strange light. And this is in the middle of the valley in the national park, and the valley is it's a run-through line for lots of wild hogs, but it's also just a breeding pool for insects. It's horrible, really, really hot, about 25 degrees at night in silly chemical suits and things like that. But one thing that's funny about pheromones is that pheromones developed around the world for lots of different animals for lots of different reasons. So the ants here developed a communication pheromone called Z916 hexadecimal, and that tells them that there's food somewhere. Whereas the wolf spider also lives in the same forest, and this is actually a sexual attractant for this wolf spider. So at the same time we're making all these little trails for ants to make them kind of follow silly little trails, we've got a whole bunch of kind of randy spiders who might be coming up and finding us. So nice and off-putting. Anyway, here's the machine in the middle of the forest. To cut, well, I think am I way over time, Jose? I'll cut it quite short. It didn't work for ages. it took a couple of weeks of testing and swearing and breaking machines and spilling powder everywhere to get ants to actually follow a trail. They kept escaping, they wouldn't follow the powder, there were all sorts of issues. And it turns out to make ants actually follow a pheromone trail, I went back and spoke to Xavier, the expert on ants, and you have to get really well-adjusted, settled ants. You have to give the ants a sense of purpose in their lives. Otherwise, they're not going to follow any pheromone trails. They're not going to be hungry when they wake up in the morning, unless they've got some brood in their nest who they want to feed. And they're not going to want to feed the brood unless they've settled their nest quite nicely. So you have to take a couple of days to enable them to kind of settle down and find their kind of place in the world. But when they do, it does actually work. So I'll skip a load of slides. And I'll show you. So this is phase 1 testing of the ant ballet. So that's the first phase of this project, which kind of just proves that you can get individual ants to follow individual trails. The next stage is going to be a mass choreography. This is going to take place with the organisation festival somewhere in Sao Paulo at some point in the next year or two. And the idea is we're going to get kind of choreographers working with the ants to cause them to dance as a whole colony in a large collective dance. The third stage of the project is going to be essentially a version of Skype for ants. So as I can print down chemicals that are the same kind of thing as a load of ants saying there's food in this direction, we can pass messages from one colony of ants to another colony of ants. And I'm working on a computer vision system at London Zoo at the moment that's going to be able to enable us to do that. Here's my little test lab in the zoo. And then phase 4 is going to involve electricity. And there's anecdotal evidence that you can control ants with electricity. So there's going to be some kind of big thing that destroys the entire project with lots of electricity and causes ants to wander around. Here's a bit of ant tracking software. And here's the way it gets exhibited to people. So this is an exhibition in Manchester. Here's a load of press stuff about it. Here's Wired magazine ran this article on it and made me do a load of really silly dressing up again and that kind of thing. But I think that's the end of the presentation. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, we're going to have the questions at the end.
Okay,
Yeah.
sure.
Do you want to sound as well?
No.
This one works a little better.
Yeah. So what if I hold it? Let's see.
Hi, so my name is Manja van der Worp, and I'm happy to be here, of course. I'm trained as a structural engineer and an architect. I teach at the AA as well as at the Bartlett, and today I'm going to not talk about ants, but talk about structures and how we can actually design and unlock behavior. So how can we actually transform something like an idea and a vision into something that works? So we are going to think about how the computer, the mind and the hand can work together. So first, we have to understand how a structure might behave in its conditions. So the conditions could be the supports, the loads that are acting on it, like other situations like the environment, like as things in games, you know, we all use kind of inspiration from that when we design structures. We have to think about the components of which this structure consists of. So this is, for instance, a drawing from a canopy that we did when I did a postgraduate at the AA. And you know, the relationship that this component inherits, so it's not only the element itself, but again, what is the relation to its neighbor and what is the information that it has embedded within it. So also, like you see a small image about ant colonies on the right and birds flying on the left. So also like actually what is a whole and what is a single element doing within it. So what is the local and global behavior and how can we control this? Then, okay, so how can we actually think about the geometry? So what does the geometry mean? Does it relate to other geometries? And how can we define and control the relations that it might have to its components? And then who is it linked to? Is it linked to different fabrication industries? Like, you know, what other influences do the parts of the structure have? So let's say this is the kind of conceptual introduction. And then what we want to do, of course, is play. So we want to understand the structure so well that actually it's not just one solution that we offer, but we want it to be not like a game, but because we understand it, we can give, let's say, an array of solutions. We can think about it as, yeah, playing with a toy. Right, so I'm going to show you quickly 3 projects that all have a specific way on how the mind, the hand and the computer work together. So the first one is a glass house that I worked on together with Hedwig Studio, and what was really interesting is that they wanted the glass to work structurally and they wanted to use a silicon bond that was only used in the car industry beforehand. Okay, so coming up with a nice little scheme here, we were asked as Arab to design the structure for this and have the least amount of steel involved. But okay, how can we actually, let's go back to this side, how can we come up with actually understanding the system? So if you know the building that we sit in, we understand it's made out of beams, out of columns, but for this structure, we don't have like an initial feeling of how something like this works. So how can we unlock the specific behavior and understanding of this structure? Okay, so we use a lot of programming as well, and also boring Excel and relations between analysis software and Rhino, in order to make models that pretty much look almost the same as the elements. So you see here that we have a shell model that we can analyze. We have all the red dots that actually are 6 overlaid different springs that define the specific behavior of the silicon bond, and how that is then connected to a small steel ridge that you can't really see. But what is really good, of course, in using all this computational programming is that we can test, what happens if we have, instead of 40 folds, we will have 32 folds, or what happens if we have, instead of, let's say, 100 points that are giving us the stiffness of the silicon bond, we only have 50, and how does that then influence? So we can actually quite quickly get an idea of how this structure behaves. So we start quite simple, also in defining like what are the different parts of the structure, because we know that geometry and structural behavior are very inherent. So okay, so we have a cylinder, part of a cylinder, part of a dome, so it should be dome, sorry, and we have the funnel part, and then we also have to understand, so how are these panels going to be constructed? So on the right hand side you see the color scheme that is giving kind of the curvature of the elements, And because there's no company in the world that can provide us this huge glass curved panels, you know, we have to actually split our model into parts and see how that would work. So here you see results of this testing, and it's actually local buckling of the plates. So what is important is that we try both to understand the global behavior and the local behavior of the system. And for instance, with buckling, you know, like when something is in compression and it tries to buckle out of plane, because we have all this, let's say, quite weak, only glued together ridges, and no steel structure effectively working, we need to really be kind of careful in understanding, you know, that we capture this behavior properly and that there are no, let's say, minor changes within the model that will just generate a complete different behavior. Okay, so here you see that the elements are actually split. So this is determined by, of course, you know, the curvature analysis, but also because of how the structure works. So you see this is like a kind of normal bricklaying pattern, because, you know, we want, of course, the structure, I don't know, do we have like a pointer or something that, or somebody has, by any chance? Well, anyway, you see that, you know, the solid parts, like always, kind of are able to weave through a kind of connected area, so we can have a proper structural behavior. Okay, then what is quite interesting is actually to find out, like in global manner, how the structure behaves. So if we just put self-weight on it, and we see that we have the support points there, so we see the reactions at the top and at the bottom. So you see that big red dot, so that means, okay, there's a lot of force coming down there. Then you see that there are actually two, yeah, fantastic, okay. Yes, great. Okay, so then you see, actually, these two yellow ones here are a bit bigger and in different direction as the other ones. So what is happening? So if we then are going to try to find out which elements are overstressed, we find that even we might think this might work as a shell, it doesn't really work as a shell, but as these two beams. And this is all told by us, by having this big red dot here and these two yellow dots here. So the interpretation of the model and the behavior of the system is in that case very interesting. So also here, another effect, so again, like jumping every time between the global and the local system, is that here we see this purple, which means compression, and here we see red and yellow, which is meaning tension. So actually that means that this whole area here is in bending. And what that means is that actually these elements here are going to be really, like, have, let's say, much higher stresses than all the other ones, and that is related back again to what we saw here. So now we understand that we don't have a shell, but we have actually a structure that is supported by our two good friends, two beams over here. Okay, so then another thing we do is also to test, so what if this bond, if we can have it a bit stiffer or a bit softer? Because as I said, so imagine we have this glue, it's only used in cars, so what is happening if that is a little bit softer or a bit harder? Okay, so actually we find out that when it is a bit softer, we have much less elements overstressed than that we had before. Okay, so we can really think about how this fabrication and the use of this bond work together with the global behavior of the structure. So we plot visually, you know, what the overstressed springs are, where the springs represent this silicon bond, so this soft gummy glue connection, and we can try to, you know, kind of define or control where these highest stressed parts are, and then feed that back into the structure. So this is an example of trying, you know, how we go through unlocking and finding, let's say, a behavior of a structure. So we try to relate the fabrication of the panels, how they can actually put stresses down back to the foundations, understanding reaction forces, and really, you know, grasping what this whole model is about. Okay, so another example. So this is a bridge, which, and the theme is going to be interaction of parameters. So again, how can we actually make from this image here a bridge that works structurally, and how can we again tackle these components and understand and generate the behavior with which the architect can work. Okay, so the idea of this bridge is that from the sea, this drifted wood is floating or whatever, growing over the seashore and forming this bridge over the road. So the idea of this randomness is very important. Okay, so how can we actually, think about how something like this might behave? So already, as you see here, which is a drawing of the architect, it's connected everywhere. How can we define a logic? So what we don't do is just make a model of this, put that into ANSYS, maybe that is what you use, analyze it and say, this one works that hard, that one works that hard, we can do it like that. No. We are trying to define a system with which we can play and really understand and secure that we understand how a structure like this behaves. Okay, so even simple models help because, in this drawing here, it is not three-dimensional. So how can all these elements actually be positioned, not crossing one another, and, sitting in all these layers? It sounds really kind of, simple, but this is also what we do. We have to really try to grasp how this might work. So again, you might even just draw it and then, oh no, that one, it can't go here because it's crossing another one. So, okay, so how can we try to do it simpler? So what we could do is actually make a truss. So you see this dotted one here at the back. And could we just, have, like, let's say some sliders in Grasshopper where we can play and make it a bit, look a bit more random. All right, so yes, of course we can do that, but this is like just one truss, and the importance is that we have this layering. Okay, so let's go a step back and actually think about this layering of trusses, and could we define different simple typologies of trusses that we know that work and know that behave in a certain way, and we, start to overlay them into one another and get this more, like as an elevation, more desired random effect. So then, this one that now looks still quite boring, but it has all these layers of elements. We have like one truss, the main truss in the middle, which are the purple and red elements. Then they are now made white in here. We have these other truss elements that sit in here, together with kind of the neighbors on this side. And then we have another layer on the outside, but actually even this kind of complicated layering now has a very simple logic, because we knew from before that we just have these simple trusses that are overlaid on top of one another. Then we can use our Grasshopper model again, move them up and down a bit, and actually make it look more random. But it is a very controlled way and a grasped behavior of this bridge. Then the consequence of course, having all these layers, like if I would have a force in this element here, and this is the main, let's say this element going down, I know that this force has to be transferred all the way there. So this actually is kind of a soft connection within this bridge. So again, we have to model these springs, try to understand how these components work, and grasp this whole behavior. But actually, from something that looked really quite complicated, we went back, dissected it, really went back to the kind of basic principles, overlaid them onto one another, and we could give them the random bridge that they were after. For the final, let's say, example of how to deal with kind of this grasping of structural behavior, I want to talk to you a bit about anisotropic behavior. So anisotropic behavior means that actually, like if we use timber compared to steel, steel we know that when it has forces in whichever direction, it behaves the same. But because timber is a grown material, it has different capacities like along the grain and perpendicular to the grain. So that is one thing already that makes this anisotropic. But also we can say that when something is actually not behaving the same because of its components, that as you see are here, are very different, actually generates something anisotropic as well, because depending on if I have a force here or if I have a force here, something really different occurs. So how can we simplify this kind of complicated, component connected structure into something that looks like this? So where this project came from, so this is designed by a Spanish architect, and it is in Segovia in Spain, where actually they have developed a game which is called Lupo, and it is actually consisted out of these components here, which they laser cut out of square panels here. So this is a yin-yang, so they have decided to use these kind of leftover panels in order to create this structure, and that is where we came part of the design team and tried to find out if we could actually make this structure stand up. So here you see the Lupo system, so it's this box, it looks a bit like Tangram, I don't know if you know that game, but you have all these different three-dimensional elements. When you put them together, they could create this structure. But we are interested in now really looking at how can we, actually digitally and in combination with physically understand what we have in our hands to play with. So we can see this not really as a game, but let's say we have some components. We have the components itself, we have the connections, and how can they all work together, and how can we actually bridge between the physical and the digital. So as I said, anisotropic material, so very simple. This one is very good in compression in the center. This one is quite good in compression from both axes, and it could take bending moment. This one wants to have forces diagonally. Right, this one, actually it's the strongest one in one direction of all of them, and then it can still have forces in this direction. So we have to actually understand for each of these types how they work as a single unit and as a combination. So what we then have suggested, because these panels were already cut, to load test them. So for instance here you can see this anisotropic behavior, because you see that here we can have 5 kilonewton, and here we can have 18 kilonewton of load attached to it. And as they say here, the grain is vertical, so that would mean like this, which means we would have block shear, which is that when part of the structure just, kind of gets pushed. And in this action, in this test, the grain is in the horizontal direction, which is much stronger, as I said. So again, actually to tell the architect how, in which orientation, which specific component he should use, was based on simple physical testing. So here you see one of the collapsed elements, so you see that it completely deforms and that we have, again, some shear where these gaps kind of create in the panels. Okay, so then they also told us we have found this kind of very nice, simple, as they think, connections, which are dowels that are connected with these little hatches at the top, and some blocks that are also connected with this small kind of IKEA-style dowels, but only a proper, let's say, fixed connection in the center. Okay, so again, even if it's super hands-on like this, it's very good to get an idea and sensitivity of what is actually happening, how does the structure fail, and what kind of forces can it take. Okay, so then this is a representation of the whole model. We now can understand for the different types of connections, again, what all of these different springs need to be. So in this one here, we have only a small connection in the center, and here we have a complete connection between the two elements, and here we have a corner piece, so again it works different. Okay, so we can test what's going on. We can say, right, actually here we need to think about this area a bit, we need to think about this area, we need to think about that area. Okay, so let us rearrange, because we only had a set number of panels, let us rearrange these panels in order to, kind of optimize this system and make it work better. So actually, because I also think I'm really running a bit over, the colors are representing, more compression, more bending, because again, we needed to be very specific for these highly stressed elements to be in the right element and be in the right orientation. So another thing which was interesting is that this is a super light material because instead of making it like very heavy foundation, the foundation is now placed within the elements. So because of course when we have this big cantilever here, the whole system tries to turn over. So in order to stop that, they use these elements as a mold for concrete, which they then put inside here. Okay, then we actually went to site, this is me here, and we saw all these let's say, predicted things happening in the structure. So we never found out that this dowel could not go through. So everywhere where we had a connection like this, it was not working. So what do we have to do? Quickly, in situ, put another plank under here. The same as at the top here. So because we only had this connection there, we actually wanted to have a block here. This whole structure, part of the structure didn't break, but you see already here that it kind of deformed. So I think even if we try to, define everything in the digital, like the physical is helping us so much to actually understand and really see if this behavior that we all try to figure out in our mind is actually true or not. So how can we simplify these behaviors? So what I love to do is to think about really like what the behavior is, understand it, grasp it, and then, design with it. Okay, thank you very much.
That should do.
Can you hear me? Hi. Hello, my name is Vera. I run a small studio called Field together with Marcus, who would have loved to be here tonight and speak to you too, but unfortunately he's a bit ill. So we've been working here in Melbourne together since 2009, studied together in Germany. And we're working across quite a big range of projects. We work on really big installations and sometimes just smaller digital print illustrations, so very different scales. And we're using a lot of digital technologies from code to CG animation to visual effects, kind of the full range. We work a lot with physics and digital simulations as well, parametric and emergent simulations, but I think compared to using these simulations in architecture, we have the slight advantage of not having to make anything work. So we can sometimes explore it a bit more freely. I'm just going to show you a couple of projects that we've done in the last few years and tell you a bit about it. project in 2010, I think, together with C Design for GF Smith, the paper manufacturer. And they bring out these really beautiful, beautifully printed paper brochures to showcase their special products. And this one was about digital print papers. So we created a generative system that created a unique cover for every single brochure in this run of 10,000 images, and really tried to do something that is purely about color and that is very abstract. On the other end of the scale is this installation project that we did a few years ago for Deutsche Bank in Hong Kong. This was a collaboration with Universal Everything. And it's a permanent installation in their lobby in Hong Kong. And it's quite a massive project. It's 12 meters long. I think it has a resolution of about 15,000 pixels in width. So it's quite an intense and challenging project on the hardware side as well. What we created was a series of 8 real-time artworks. So everything that you see is generated in real time. And we picked up on a couple of their brand values to develop these stories. The idea is that every time you come by, you see a slightly different iteration of the same films. This one's based on a city layout generator that works in two different ways. We have a gridded pattern like Manhattan and a medieval pattern like Paris. This is way too fast. Maybe it helps when you stick to 15 minutes. This one's again based on the city generator, different interpretation of it. And I think the next one that we're seeing was actually a collaboration with Memo, who's speaking right after me, who worked on one of the pieces. Not that one. Oh, that one too. Yes, of course, 2 of them. This was based on really high-res photographs that we tried to bring to life with small kind of effects overlays. This was the other one that we worked on now. It's using pre-recorded motion capture data and then playing it back and loading it into a 3D scene in real time and taking different camera perspectives on these choreographies. So we're often at this intersection of art, design and branding, sometimes into advertising a little bit. And feel quite comfortable at that spot. This was another installation project that we worked on about a year ago. For GE in Australia and displayed. This was a travelling LED installation which was driven by an online poll. It was a big campaign that they ran in Australia asking people for their 2 words for tomorrow. So people were submitting their hopes and concerns in the future wrapped in 2 words. And I think we got the nicest part of the campaign. We were asked to build this installation, and we decided, because it was installed in public spaces, to not make it a very readable data visualization as you might expect it, something a lot more mesmerizing and visual. So it's a real-time animation system that is triggered by the incoming word submissions, and the system actually is based on a musical idea. It goes through different moods, and sometimes it gets more jazzy, and sometimes it gets a bit more blues, depending on what kind of commissions are coming in or submissions are coming in. Is this working out actually when I'm talking over it? Yeah, so this is something that we really like doing, to work with data inputs or have something interactive, but really just use it as a tool wherever it kind of fits into the story that we want to tell. I'll show you one more installation project that we did for a gallery in Paris. It's called La Technique, and this was a show called Supercomputer Romantics, which was a solo show of Matt Pike and his friends, of which we were one. That's Marcus. This is the biggest space in the gallery, and it already came with this gridded structure. So what you're seeing is actually a projection onto these onto acoustic panels. It's not little screens, even though it looks quite nice like that. So we quickly had this idea to put a little creature into every single one of these boxes, and have a big celebration of life in this kind of cathedral-like hall. And making things come to life a little bit, and making them alive and dynamic was something that we've been interested in from the very start, actually. But we didn't want to just make creatures and make them come to life by sticking eyes on it. So we were looking for something else, and stumbled across the Space Invaders once more. So this is really all about symmetry. And it's the symmetry that makes us believe that we are dealing with real, alive creatures. So I'll talk about a little more of the structure behind this, about this project. So the first steps in the design process were, once we had found this clue that it's so simple, it's all about symmetry. We played around with different grids and different grid resolutions. And just dotted a couple of dots in the space and then mirrored it to the other side. And it already looks a little bit like faces sometimes, maybe. Then we connected the points into limbs and made them spring connections so they could start to move around. Then we gave them different shapes. These are the kind of more muscular shapes, but all the other styles that you've seen in the videos, they're based on the same skeletons, and that's the skeleton that we animate. What you see on top is really just a different skin for them. And then we had a really fun time starting to animate them and to teach them to dance. So we had a whole range of dances and choreographies that we could tell them. which were really quite literal, like raise your arms or shake your hips, stomp with your feet, and because the different skeletons and the different body shapes, they're sometimes very regular, and then they're very good dancers, good performers, but some of them only have one arm, or they might not have any legs at all. So there's some dances that they simply can't do, which is very, very pitiful. And yeah, this is what Marcus and I did then for 2 weeks before the opening. We were locked up in this dark holodeck space in Paris, and Marcus built a system for it that has a more complex layer that handles the simulation, and then a scripted layer on top, which allowed him to compile it almost in real time, so we could control this whole room all around us and play around with the different dances. So what happens in the installation is that we have a 40-minute pre-produced soundtrack by Simon Pike, which is a really great piece of music, and then every iteration, every 40 minutes that we start, we completely regenerate the cast of our show. And then they're dancing through the same choreography and a bit of an evolution from very simple creatures to more complex and limbed things. Yes, I could play this forever. There's another, I think this is online somewhere if you really want to see all of it. There's another level of complexity that's going on in the room, which is kind of the spatial patterns, how we're turning on the cells on and off, which uses a couple of different algorithms and patterns, a game of life, distributing, and more graphical patterns. And then it kind of all came together with the look and the skins on it. So yeah, a really a big complex system that just grew out of loads of very simple rules interacting and creating something that really feels alive. Last year we worked for over half of the year on a personal project. We stopped all and any commercial work for a really long time, and it was called Energy Flow. It is called Energy Flow because it's still out there. It's a film experience for iOS and Android tablets. We launched in December. It's available for free, so go and get it if you want. What we did is we produced 10 short animated films that all revolve around the idea of a transition of energy on physical, social, spiritual levels, and the idea that the big shifts that we've seen in the last few years are somehow connected on a metaphysical level. So a very personal project, and I'll just show you the trailer to give you a bit of an idea. We did this together with the Creators Project. So 10 short films, from one about the riots in Hackney to hunting animals, dice being thrown, very, very symbolic and metaphorical things. We cut all of the clips up into really short snippets of between 2 and 10 seconds duration, and put them into a big library. They were tagged by their intensity and kind of their place in the place that they could potentially take in a narrative arc and other parameters. And then we built a software composer system to generate 1,000 unique films out of this material. So again, it was a rules-based system that was working on multiple layers and kind of interacting rules. And we were generating a really wide range of narrative sequences. For example, the system was based on this old, very classical idea of the Greek drama structure that you have, intensity increasing and retardations and intros and outros. But we generated all sorts of possible combinations of them. And then we were filling these narrative structures with clips from the library, always taking 2 to 3 stories and juxtaposing them to create very experimental and very abstract, but still narratives that would, be valid as a story. So the second step after generating this big variety of stories was to validate them. So we kept the generation process really open, and then to kind of not limit ourselves in the first step, and then we had a rules system to validate them. And those were sometimes just really simple things. For example, the dice scenes that we had were kind of meant to work as interstitials, so we didn't allow them to appear as the very first or the very last clip, or other things like the last clip in the sequence must not be shorter than 5 seconds, because otherwise it would work as an ending. Apart from that, there was a dozen other rules that were working in the system. The sound was completely generated too. We had a range of different music packs, sample packs, that again had different samples for the different narrative positions in the dramatic curve. And every film had its own generated soundtrack. We worked together with David Kamp on this piece and on many other projects actually, from day one, to kind of develop something that would be a real audiovisual generative system. That's always quite interesting and important for us in all projects to feed them from the same simulation almost, or from the same generative structure. And in this project it was particularly interesting because we wanted to use the music to almost tint your experience of the film. So you might see the same material reappearing in iteration 3 or 4 or 5, but you get a different feeling for it because you're hearing different music with it. So the app experience itself, and I hope you'll have a chance to give it a go, it starts with a really simple interactive game where you spin a dice, and that's just your random seed generator, if you like. You end up with a number, and that's the iteration between 1 and 999 films that you're going to see. I have a small clip about the composer software, which I'm going to show you. So at first, when we started working on this idea, we were very interested in the generative storytelling and making the films, and along the way, we got more and more excited about it actually becoming a film distribution project. So we had a completely automated pipeline that was generating the narratives, stitching them together in films, generating After Effects comps, then processing the film into different streaming settings, uploading to the server, and all those steps. And it was kind of, making the most of pre-produced content that was, using the high quality production processes, post-production means, and combining that with something dynamic and interactive. We're just preparing different kind of spin-offs of the project. We're probably going to do an installation with just bringing out some director's cuts of the films, which are probably coming out this week. And I brought you the first one, which would be the last piece that I'm going to show, and then I'm going to pass on to Mimi. Thank you.
Where is it? Power as well.
Hello, hello, hello. Hi everyone, my name is Manuel.
Oh, yeah.
I don't usually show this, but I made it exactly 10 years ago, so I thought I could show it because actually nothing's really changed. I studied structural engineering in Turkey many years ago. I didn't want to do that. I fled basically the army, came to London, made video games for 5 years. Then 10 years ago I said, okay, I don't want to make video games, I just want to make abstract shit. I don't really know what I want to be doing, but I know I just want to be doing just some random stuff. That was exactly 10 years ago. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I have been doing since then. I work as an independent artist. I set up a company called the Nexus Visuals Company, which was just myself. And then about 2 years ago, I set up a new company called Market Laserpiece with 2 other friends. It's just a tiny studio, and I'll talk a little bit about the kind of stuff we've been doing, kind of bordering on art, artistic R&D, and commercial projects. But I want to start right at the beginning.
Everything started with the Big Bang. It was a Saturday night, and God and his roommate Chugs were arm wrestling. You going down, man? Oh, dude, that is sick. Yeah, undefeated. Oh, wait, here comes another one. Quick, give me your light.
And so that's how the universe was created. And that's pretty much where my interests begin. When people ask me, like, what inspires you? What do you think about? Basically, this is pretty much all I think about. The Big Bang and everything that's happened since then. And there's a lot of really, really fascinating things happening in the world, in the universe. And that's just what really gets me going. I'm just trying to understand as much of this as I can and somehow abstract and amplify the things that I see that I find really, really interesting. And there's a lot of things really interesting, including numbers. There's a lot of really, really interesting numbers as well. And I want to talk a little bit about that because I find it really important in kind of what I do. For example, omega. This is also known as a density parameter. So basically the universe is expanding. This is pretty much known as a fact. And until about 10, 15 years ago, we didn't even know if the universe expansion was if it was slowing down to a degree where it would eventually become a big crunch. Now, if you imagine that you throw a cannon into the air, that's like the Big Bang. The ball goes up, gravity's pulling on it, so it's slowing down. Eventually, this cannon might start falling again and hit the Earth. That's the big crunch. Or if you shoot it fast enough, it'll go into orbit. Now, we actually know now that it's not even slowing down, it's accelerating, but that's kind of besides the point. The interesting thing is, there's a number called omega, which is called the density parameter, and it's the ratio of the amount of gravity in the universe to a critical amount of matter in the universe, which would differentiate between an infinite expansion versus a collapse back into the big crunch. Now, if this number is bigger than 1, it means there's so much gravity in the universe that the universe will start shrinking again. If this number is less than 1, it means there's not enough gravity in the universe. It will carry on expanding. Right now, this number is around 0.3. 1 second after the Big Bang, this number was exactly 1. It was exactly 1 to a million billionth. If this number had been a million billionth different to 1, we wouldn't have the universe today. If it was a bit too big, the universe would have collapsed in on itself and would have long gone, but we wouldn't even exist. The universe wouldn't exist. If it was a tiny bit less than 1, the universe would have expanded so quickly that the hydrogen wouldn't collapse to become helium, we wouldn't have helium, we wouldn't have carbon, we wouldn't have Earth, we wouldn't have Starbucks, none of this would exist. So that's how important it is to have that number right. So now you're probably thinking, why the hell am I telling you all this? Is this a physics lecture? No. Am I trying to prove that somehow God exists? No, because he clearly doesn't. What I'm trying to talk about here is how important it is to get numbers right, and I'm on a quest to find these magic numbers. And finding these numbers doesn't have to be this geeky or this boring. I often talk about the piano as a metaphor for everything I do. It works on many levels. For example, on the outside, it's a really, really beautiful, very simple instrument. It's a piece of interaction design, ingenuity. There's 88 keys. You hit a key and it makes a sound. You hit it hard, it makes a loud sound. You hit it soft, it makes a soft sound. That's pretty much it. You go up, it's high notes. You hit it on the lower side, it's lower notes. But underneath, it's a real feat of engineering. And today they ask me, oh, technology and art, can it mix? Well, this thing is nuts. I mean, this thing is really complicated. You press a pedal, the whole keyboard shifts up, moves over so it's soft. You hit a key, there's a curve to the weight of the key, so that when you hit it, it maps with the intensity of the note. And this simple thing, in the hands of a master, can make you cry. And that's something that really fascinates me. Again, it's all about numbers. Not to be too reductionist, but one example I like to give. Moonlight Sonata by Beethoven. This is basically just a bunch of numbers. You know, he's saying you hit C sharp, you hit G sharp. It's just a sequence of numbers, yet this sequence of numbers, different to a different sequence of numbers, has a whole huge difference of effect. So, I'm trying to find these numbers. This particular song, there's also an aspect of this metaphor, which is, this is what Beethoven wrote. You write this on a piece of paper, the numbers that he told you to play. So this is Rubinstein playing, doing a very good job. Listen. And I also searched on YouTube, someone just random, I just searched for me playing Moonlight Sonata, and I found this. I found tons, but this is one particular one. So this is the same numbers, but it's not really delivering the same effects that we had previously. So clearly it's not the exact same numbers. The notes are the same numbers. The timing is roughly the same, but not exactly. Maybe it's a few milliseconds off. But we are so fine-tuned, we can detect that. Maybe we're not consciously detecting that it's a few milliseconds off, but subconsciously, she's not delivering the same performance that Rubinstein delivered. Also, the intensities that she's hitting the notes, the volumes of each note are not delivering the same effect. So this also shows how important those numbers are on a minuscule level. But then the metaphor goes even beyond. I said that this particular version isn't delivering the same emotional performance that we got from Rubinstein. It's basically a bit rubbish. But if you ask that girl, while she was playing it, how she felt, she probably connected with the song more than we connected with it when Rubinstein played it. And this is the aspect of the importance of real-time interactive systems, which is another channel in my work that I'm going to come to. So basically the two main aspects here is the importance of numbers and fine-tuning, and also the connection that one gets when they're real-time interacting with an instrument. So I'm going to jump forward a few billion years, actually, since the Big Bang. And then this project is from 2007, or maybe 2008, I can't remember. And the reason why it's important is my background is visual arts. I was doing a lot of animation, a lot of basically keyframes, 3D, 2D work. But I was also interested in programming and developing systems. I had the opportunity to do visuals for an opera. It was a 50-minute film, and I was basically designing the contents for this opera. It was an art project, which meant very low budget, but very long lead time. So I had a year to think about what I wanted to do. So instead of basically animating this, I just kept thinking, what do I want it to do? What do I want it to do? What kind of behaviors do I want? And I programmed just the whole thing. I basically, the way I explain it is, I made a video game that does for this particular performance. And I would just listen to the music, I'd imagine in my head I want them to sit down, I want to feel them quiver. It's a very abstract film with no narrative, other than a kind of journey through different states of emotion. So I thought, what emotions do I want to convey? How can I convey that? And then about a week before the performance, it's a touring show, so I wouldn't tour with it. What I did was a week before the premiere, I sat down and I recorded a visual performance. I just sat down with a bunch of sliders, pressed play on the music, and I just performed it and recorded that. So I want to play a 2-minute excerpt from this 50-minute film. So this was quite an important project for me because I've been experimenting a lot with basic code-based generative procedural systems, but this was my first big live project. It was at the World Festival Hall, and then it toured a 50-minute film which I basically performed. And it was just absolutely amazing to be able to respond to the music in real time, as opposed to placing keyframes, rendering, realizing it didn't work, and then it just felt very unintuitive. So for anyone interested, I wrote it in C++ in an open source toolkit called Open Frameworks, and I put a lot of add-ons for it, which are still out there. If anyone's interested, github.com/memo. I wrote a physics library, which was originally for this, a fluid library, which was originally for this, a whole bunch of stuff. So this was the start of me saying, okay, I'm never going to do a keyframed animation again. I just want to create systems and then run stuff through these systems. And then another area of research that I was doing was computer vision. The reason for this came about, my biggest passion was creating moving image and music and the strong connection between the two. And I thought, well, My Secret Heart was great because I was responding to the music, but still my interface to the system was sliders. And there's such a thing called dance. It's millions of years old probably. This is us using our body to communicate how we feel. So I thought, well, that's the perfect interface. And I started working with computer vision, which is basically using a camera, track people's movements, and try and extrapolate from that. So I thought the dancer's body would be the vessel through which we can create these moving images. I did loads of projects around this. One of them was called Body Paint, which I like for its simplicity. I'll just play an excerpt. It's basically a wall, and you move and create virtual paint. This is before the Connect and all that. This was 2009, and it's still kind of touring. It started off, like I said, as a way for me to be able to create moving images and animate and extrapolate their movements to sound. But this ended up being an interactive installation for other reasons I'm going to talk about it later. And this is one of those projects which I did many different versions of. I really think of that whole period, 2009-2010, as I did one project with lots of little tips. And this was one of the tips. I'm really not into that at all. And I think I'll show the second Tom and Jerry cartoon for the day. When people talk about, again, inspirations for all of this, it's important to point out the really, really important artists who were exploring this. Myron Kruger was doing a lot of really seminal work in the 70s and 80s with computer vision in terms of taking people's movements. Many people don't realize this. They think it's quite a new thing. But actually, 70s, 80s is full of geniuses working with camera-based inputs and creating music and visuals. But my inspiration wasn't that, because I didn't know about Myron Kruger when I was 5. What I did know was Tom and Jerry, and actually, again, people like Norman McLaren, Oscar Fisinger, huge inspirations. But when I was 5, I wasn't watching any of that stuff. What I was watching was Tom and Jerry, and actually, I think it's one of the finest pieces of synesthetic media ever created. The connection between the music and the imagery is just intense. I just want to show this little clip, and just pay attention to the connections. Well, you get the idea. I mean, I could leave this running all day, but... So this was really what was driving me, that connection between the music and the image. It's so tight that you don't even notice it. It just fades into the background. So similar to body paint, which was movement into image, I was also interested in movement into sound. Again, there were lots of experiments, but I was really interested in trying to create a system which sounded real. I didn't want it to sound computerized. I wanted it to sound like a real physical instrument. So this was a series of works which started again about 2007. This particular incarnation was 2010, and this is again pre-Connect. It was an installation open to the public, trying to create a new instrument. So all the sound is generated from the movements. I was quite comfortable with camera-based systems, also because I was using open frameworks, huge open source community. So this job was mainly just number tweaking and creating rules. You do a first pass, you listen to it, doesn't sound right, why doesn't it sound right? Fix the numbers, fix the rules. And this is where this is why I talk about Omega. Just getting those numbers right is what makes the difference between it working and not working. Similarly, this next project was for a ballet, and this is interesting because it's non-interactive to the public. It's basically a film it's projected on a gauze. It's something that the audience watches, but it's made through interactive means, which again for me was very important. Instead of animating this by hand, I created a system, fed footage from a dancer into the system, and played with the system to get it to do what I wanted it to do. And I'll play and kind of talk over it. Basically, this was one day's work, because by this time I had done so many projects like this that I had the code base ready. Technically, it's relatively straightforward. It's analysis of the camera feed with an optical flow algorithm, which basically detects pixel movements. It's all out there in the open source world. This optical flow is fed into a fluid simulation, which again, it's all out there in the open source world. So this job was basically, again, number tweaking and just setting the rules. I had a rough idea what I wanted it to look like, so I would do that, and then I'd run it. While it's running, I'd step back, look at it, and what do I like, what do I not like? For example, I want it to be a bit more wispy. How do I get it more wispy? I need to inject a bit more velocity, so you add that behavior. And then you realize, oh, it's curling too much. So, okay, you need to add an uncurling behavior. So it's very step by step, very iterative. It's really important to communicate this because many people often look at the final step and think, well, how did you get there? You don't get to the final step in one step, you get there in many, many steps. So it's just a case of taking one step, seeing where you are, seeing where you want to go, take the next step. This is how I work, this is how many people in this field work. I think it's the exact opposite of how proper programmers work. They like to plan everything out, make diagrams on paper. Once everything's sorted, then you start implementing. I'm the exact opposite. Start writing straight away and then just meander. So, I might have to skip a few projects because I think I'm running a bit late. This one I can quickly show. This was a commercial adaptation of that. Depeche Mode saw that, wanted it for a music video. We debated a bit because I wanted to do something else because I've already done the Fiery Guy. So we kind of came to a compromise. This video was directed by a good friend of mine, Barney Steele, who actually I've set up my Laser Feast with now. So this was our first collaboration on that project. And again, all the visuals here was just created through software, custom software, film a dancer, stick it in the system, play with some numbers, and just record the output. Yeah. Legend. So, I'll talk of another line of work. All of these previous projects I would categorize as one category of projects that I was interested in, which is human movement into music, into imagery. This is a more basic, fundamental element of what I'm interested in now, which is what I was talking about at the beginning, just fascinated by little things that I see around. So this is a very natural phenomenon. A bunch of pendulums, they create these really interesting patterns. So when I saw this video, the first thing I thought is, I wonder what it would sound like. This experiment is very well documented, the exact length of each string and what the oscillation frequency of each pendulum is. So I was able to recreate it. The interesting thing about this for me is how sonically and visually we have very different sensitivities. Visually, I think we're spatially more sensitive. I can and I can estimate pretty precisely how far away it is just through my sight. But if I hear a sound, it's a lot harder for me to estimate how far away it is. I can have a rough idea, but I'm more precise if I see something. So that's in the spatial dimension. But temporally, I find myself a lot more sensitive sonically than visually. If I can hear a beat, I can detect if that beat is exactly on the beat or if it's off by a few milliseconds, for example. But if I see something flashing, it's hard for me to know if that flash is accurate to within a few milliseconds or not. So I'm less sensitive. Also, on a micro scale, if I hear a sound and then you double that sound's frequency, that's an octave. Most people can kind of tell when a note is an octave of another one, but if you have a frequency of color and you double the frequency, say red to blue, I don't know anyone who can say, yep, that hue is exactly the double of that. So when you take a pattern in one domain and from, say, sight, and shift it to the sonic domain, you start realizing different aspects of that pattern. And that's really what this is about. And I got really obsessed with this and did loads of experiments. I'm going to play a little excerpt of a couple of them. Obsessed. I've got loads of these. They're all on my website. If you Google Memo, Simple Harmonic Motion, it should come up. And again, the only difference between each iteration is numbers. Just the frequency of each thing, the notes that they generate. I'll skip the rest of these. Yeah, these are just all different versions. This was another project I did. I'll skip this one actually, it's because I'm a bit behind. It's a bit similar to the previous projects. Whoops. Let's see. Okay, I'm going to fast forward to this. This was a Martian Laser Feast project, so this is a commercial project. It's for Saatchi and Saatchi, though it's lucky that it's not actually promoting a product. It was in Cannes, and basically they just wanted to have a show for the, some advertising thing, I can't remember actually. And they just wanted a show, so it was very fortunate, and we had done this show the year before. They came to us about 2 months before the show, and they said, yeah, just do some visuals for us. And we did, and it was great. But most importantly, we became really, really good friends with the client who was Saatchi and Saatchi. And we said to them, next year when you do that same show, don't come to us 2 months before the deadline and tell us to do some projections. Let's start talking about it now, and let's come up with a really, really crazy idea. Because the whole point of this show is to blow away 3,000 advertising execs who were hungover from the night before. So, in February last year, we went down to Cornwall, to a place called Whitsun Bay. It's basically no electricity, no internet, it's just raw. And we were there, 5 guys, 3 from Martian Laser Feast, my founders, and the 2 creatives from Saatchi and Saatchi. And we just ate, discussed, talked about life, got drunk, all that kind of stuff. And then we pitched our idea, flying robots of laser beams. And they were the creatives, so they said, okay, great. Then we told the producers, and they were like, what? Anyway, long story short, we sold the idea. We actually couldn't use lasers because the show's in France, and due to some apology for Jean-Michel Jarre, we think lasers have been banned. They're trying to wipe Jean-Michel Jarre in the country. So we said, we can't use lasers, we'll use some kind of lights. And we used these DMX-controlled moving head spotlights that have a very focused beam. They're too heavy to mount on quad rotors, which I'll come to in a minute. So we'll put all the lights on the ground, and we'll put mirrors on these quad rotors, which are the flying robots. Basically these. So you might know about these. They're drones. They're really, really hot topic right now. Last year they were a little bit less hot topic, but still a really hot topic. So we basically wanted to choreograph an army of these flying around in sync with music, with LEDs and mirrors on motors, just to make it more complicated. And they would fly around, we'd track them with the lights, and we'd choreograph the show. And I'll play an excerpt of the show, and then just probably wrap up. This video's here somewhere. Yeah.
You need not fear the great unknown anymore. For soon all will be revealed.
So that was the last project I showed, but I just want to end on a few other notes, which is really, I studied structural engineering, so my purpose was to design things that would work. I found that too much of a burden. Like Vera said, I have the luxury of not having to make things that actually work, but I find it really important to try and rekindle the sense of discovery that we all have as kids, where the whole world is constantly an experiment for us. All children are basically scientists. When they're splashing around in a puddle, they're basically conducting a science experiment. They're trying to see, trying to learn. And as we get older, we lose that, and the world becomes a lot more boring. So what I try to do is try and create new situations in which we regress to that state where we're trying to learn and trying to understand and really have a sense of rediscovery. I'm going to skip these next few slides, which I think I've already had anyway. Well, I can't skip it, so we'll have to wait. I can skip these. I'd like to end on this.
I have a friend who's an artist, and has sometimes taken a view which I don't agree with very well. You hold up a flower and say, look how beautiful it is, and I'll agree on it. And he says, you see, as I as an artist can see how beautiful this is, but you as a scientist, take this all apart and it becomes a dull thing. And I think that he's kind of nutty. First of all, the beauty that he sees is available to other people and to me too. I believe, although I may not be quite as refined as aesthetically as he is, that I can appreciate the beauty of the flower. At the same time, I see much more about the flower than he sees. I could imagine the cells in it, the complicated actions inside, which also have a beauty. I mean, it's not just beauty at this dimension of 1 centimeter, there's also beauty in the smaller dimensions. The inner structure, also the processes, the fact that the colors of the flower evolve in order to attract insects to pollinate it is interesting. It means that insects can see the colony. It adds a question. Does this aesthetic sense also exist in the lower forms? Why is it aesthetic? All kinds of interesting questions which the science knowledge only adds to the excitement, the mystery, and the awe of a flower. It only adds. I don't understand how it subtracts.
Thank you.
We're running a bit late, but we're still going to have a roundtable, some questions. If anybody has some questions. And the speakers, if you want to join the roundtable. So anybody have any questions? Maybe I'm going to shoot. Maybe this first question, while we wait for the other speakers, especially for Vera and Memo, thanks for the great presentations. I was interested or curious about some of the words that you use, like when the code or when the design comes alive, right? And I think it was kind of recurrent in some of the presentations as well, this idea of this design coming alive or just becoming something else, right? Like some people really talk about emergence, but in your case, like despite the whole theory aside, you know, in some moment these kind of right numbers start kind of getting somewhere else. You mentioned, you know, the piano could make someone cry. So these kind of ideas are kind of interesting to me. And maybe if you could just mention more this idea of how do you see that relation between technology, coding, and also this idea that could potentially like artificial life or ideas of artificial intelligence, maybe. How do you connect those together, or why do you see them recurrently coming up? Yeah.
Hi again. That was a very comprehensive question. Hello. I can see you all. Hi. Yeah, I think one thing that's important for us is that we use a lot of technology, but the works that we do are never about technology. It's always just using something to get somewhere else. And I think that was the case in many of the works today, that it's a means to reach a different aim, to tell a story or to create something that looks random but that it's not, or something that feels musical and that actually feels natural to us. And sometimes you break things along the way. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if anybody else wants to comment.
I didn't hear the question. I have no idea. Well, what I find interesting about kind of, you know, sitting amongst you guys, it's really about like kind of the playfulness and the interpretation, let's say, of the media that we work with. And I still think, you know, every like one of us searches in kind of their own ways for something really creative. So I find that actually quite nice to then showcase here, like, yeah, the different range of works that, yeah, that can lead to, really. I don't know. Should I answer one of your questions? Do you have some questions?
So I'm not really sure what my role is supposed to be here, but I'm going to just be the protagonist, I guess. It's kind of what you found. But we're in architecture school, and this is an event in architecture school. Some of you taught in architecture school, have been architecture students. I'm curious about what you think the students that are here today, because there are many of them that I see that I think are taught or been associated with, could get out of viewing your work as something that they could take and learn from. And I'm wondering, like, where do you find application for their own work in yours?
Well, I think the reason why, say, I might be here, or Vera, where we don't clearly do anything that could even stand in the real world, let alone support life. It's mainly, I guess, we both, well, all of us as well, including the architectural ones, it's computational design is a big part of it. It's also, parametric design, thinking about rules, algorithms, designing systems to achieve what we want them to achieve. It might happen that our end goal is a little bit different, but hopefully the processes and the steps of getting to whatever goal we have might be similar. It's all about solving problems, where you have an idea of what you want to do, you just have to figure out how to get there. So it's figure out step one, find the problem, solve the problem, take out the next problem and solve that. And that's really how you get to where you want to get to. So hopefully we've explained a little bit about the process of how we do that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, in terms of actually being useful for architects, I think the thing that we've all done is defined our own kind of parameters and the way that we do our work, and something that you have to do something that you're really lucky if you're, Bartlett or the A or somewhere around here, is that you have this great kind of test bed where you can really just play with ideas. You can do stuff that you wouldn't be able to do necessarily in the real world. You can create geometry structures that will fall down. You don't have to worry about gravity necessarily. But you do that in order to define the boundaries that you then work within at a later date to do real architecture or to do whatever it is you want to do.
So is real architecture not about experience then? Because I think, actually maybe that is like where it's all shifting. So where the engagement maybe of the body or the experience of a wall, of a space, actually it's completely changing. So I think that maybe the distance is actually, becoming shorter and shorter to media-driven art. I don't know really what to call it, so sorry for that. But yeah, I think that is actually, quite interesting, and definitely as an architect to take inspiration what then a space could mean, or I don't know, I find that really interesting. And also, maybe like more from me as well, a question to you, like, so kind of the artistic sense of it as well, like, as being an architect, you have also like a set time, then this is your deadline, so you hit the same point, of course, but what is, like, I don't know, so do you think it is the same kind of artistic means that you use as like, engaging the body in the experience? Is that a relation maybe to the architectural part?
I don't know. What it also like Norma said, it comes down to experience and to be in a room with other people, with art, architecture around you, and kind of meeting in that space. So that's definitely something that art and architecture have in common, but certainly not the only thing.
Can I ask one more? You mentioned, Mimo, about this idea of open source as well. Like, I think that this kind of plays a big role in lots of the work that we're seeing today. And it's interesting that in some circles, this idea of open source is related to almost kind of a very quick way of just, let's say, copy-pasting or kind of getting your design just like to kind of larger audience, but also like there's kind of bad or negative things about it in terms of like people copying, right? But it seems that your work is completely some of the most creative work out there, and it's really great, and somehow it seems paradoxical that it's linked to this open source community. And I've been experiencing that myself, and I think that it's counterintuitive somehow that these kind of communities that share somehow get to kind of drive more and more creativity as well. And I think that this is something that architecture is starting to touch, and I think that it's very useful to kind of get exposed a little bit of your work, and how do you see that relation as well, and what has been the experience with that community, maybe?
Okay, yeah, this is something that I'm really passionate about. Sharing technical know-how is crucial. I can only do the things that I did because other people shared their technical know-how. Having to reinvent the wheel is just retarded. I mean, it is just retarded. You shouldn't have to reinvent the wheel. If someone's invented the wheel, they should share the blueprints. So there's actually divisions in the open source world as to how to do it. And I'm of a particular school. I don't open source my projects. What I do is I actually spend a lot of time open sourcing tools. Like I said that after My Secret Heart, I open sourced the fluid library, physics library, a whole bunch of libraries. If I'd released the source code for My Secret Heart, it was a complete mess. It was just a big old bowl of spaghetti. So after the project, I took time to refactor everything. I made a physics library with a nice API, a fluid library, and as a result, just a straight example, I released a fluid library, and then, well, I was going to say some guy, Andrew Bell, who basically wrote Cinder, which I know Phil used a lot, optimized it 200%, so it runs twice as fast. This benefits me, like, directly, because now my library runs twice as fast. But better still, that's a direct advantage. The indirect advantage is tons of people who maybe don't have the engineering background to write a fluid simulation can use my fluid library, do projects that blow me away, that I look at and I go, oh wow, that's such a good idea, let's give me another idea. So it feeds my creativity. If I had released just the app, I don't think I would have got that. So for me, sharing technical know-how is just a must, because I feed off other people's technical know-how. I was mentioning optical flow. I don't know how to do optical flow. There's an open source library called OpenCV, which does optical flow. You know, I don't want to read all those crazy papers. So this is just crucial. And the way I use this analogy is, you know, if I'm a sculptor and I make a statue, I don't want to give away my statue. I want to give away the tools that I use to make that statue. And I say, okay, to get this kind of effect on the statue, this is the tool I made. Here's the blueprints, you can go and recreate that tool. And then someone takes that tool, they create their own statue. They might improve that tool and release it for other people to use. So we just, you know, stand on the shoulders of each other and move forward. So I went on for quite a bit there.
I think you already said everything. Totally agree. Yeah, it doesn't make much sense to, you know, if you were releasing just a project code, you wouldn't actually be able to do anything with it. And the other way around, it works probably the same. If you are releasing the bits of something, it doesn't necessarily mean that people are all going to copy your work or achieve the same things with it. So I think it's just a lot more of a contemporary viewpoint on sharing and copying, and just not being afraid that anybody's going to steal your work, but that usually something good comes out of it.
Can I just add one thing though, actually? Part of your question, so I wrote this fluid library and I released it, it's called MSA Fluid, and I made a demo for it. It's quite a pretty demo, it's like very psychedelic fluid, lots of particles. That was a mistake, because by releasing a pretty looking demo, that demo has now, people are selling it. I released it as open source, every single multi-touch table is released with that, people are selling it all over the world. And I regret releasing such a pretty, good-looking demo for it, because the whole point is you release a demo because you want people to learn how to use the tool, but if it's too good-looking, they don't change it. What I want is I want people to look at the demo to learn how to use the tool, not just sell what I made with it already. So that's the tip, don't do good-looking demos.
Does anybody in the audience have any questions?
So you both work in business with members and so you both work in both commercial and creative. And you remember you talked about how the commercial is about getting the code right, getting it working system, but in art it's not the same. So how do you kind of separate yourself, because you're working in both domains really? How do you separate yourself and say, when do I stop in creative side?
I think it's not necessarily two different approaches. It's just you know, a range where you pan left and right of how you deal with things. I mean, you always want to have something in the end that works, and you always have a certain creative freedom that might be very limited or might be very open, but it's always there. And I think one way we try to deal with it is that we try to do commercial projects that have a lot of creative freedom. We try to be a little bit picky and keep the studio small to be able to afford doing that. And the other thing is that our research projects are also always an explorative space that allows us to try out things that a commercial time frame and budget wouldn't allow us to do. Being able to try out something like Energy Flow or like the films that we did in the past, and gives us that space that always kind of feeds into commercial projects afterwards, in terms of experience, and also just as an example when people see it and might pick up on it.
Yeah, but basically pretty much exactly the same. The commercial projects that I try and do are the ones which I would like to do anyway. So I often ask myself, would I do this if I wasn't getting paid? And the answer isn't always yes, unfortunately. But sometimes the answer is yes. And those are the best commercial projects where I think I do this for free. I don't tell the client that. But and ultimately that is what pays. The biggest difference I found, though, I should point out, I've done a few commercial projects where I'm quite happy with it, but the difference in doing, say, a commissioned art piece is the curator. Like, I've been fortunate to work with really good curators who really suck out the best of you. Like, the conversations you have, the context they put it in, you find yourself delivering better. When I've been doing work with commercial clients, usually it's the opposite. It's usually me trying to explain to them why I need to do that. So that's a bit of a drain. And one thing which I hope will improve. The Sanchez show is an exception. That was really, for me that was the only project I've done which is I would consider a brand commissioned artwork, where it's completely open brief, there's no logo, there's no none of that. But other than that, yeah, it's just try and maintain creative control, because I felt it's not as exciting.
Any other questions?
I have a question about time frames. So it looks like in the digital world, which you guys can play, so everything has been moving very, very fast. And I'm wondering, do you feel it accelerating to the end of the universe, or are we kind of reaching this plateau, or are we dropping? And maybe the other in the architectural world, because I think as an architect, I feel it accelerating now, maybe 10 years after the digital world. Kind of wanting to get your ideas on that.
Well, okay, I'll just quickly add, it's insanely fast. I'm not a fan of the pace in the commercial world. It's just ridiculous. There's rarely time to explore. The Sanchez show is an exception for us because we had lots of time to explore the idea, not to develop. Once we got the green light, we only had 6 weeks. And I'd never seen a quadrotor, let alone to develop that. But to develop the idea, we had lots of time. In the commercial world, in my experience, it might be different in yours or probably yours as well. Like, you get a brief, you say, okay, we need this, the show's happening in 2 months. There's not even an idea yet. That's just ridiculous. We're trying to slow it down, but clients aren't educated yet, because they're used to TV commercials being able to churn out that quickly. So I think it's a client education thing. Like now, after the quadrotor show, we've got loads of requests saying, we want a quadrotor show, we have a show in 3 weeks. We say, no, give us 3 months, give us 4 months. So slowly they're being educated that for this kind of work, it's different.
Yeah, I mean, one thing, or one way to deal with that, like I mentioned before, is to do our own research, where we can take enough time to try out something new that we might find interesting and have the freedom to fail without the time pressure in your neck. I think another point about it is that you just need to, sorry, I lost my point. That you find the space to try something out somewhere else, or
because I definitely think that we are kind of a little bit behind in the architectural world, especially like we had in the Nexus 1, Gennaro Senatore, which is this engineer, talking about, again, open source libraries and almost building this kind of structural system, but again, like playing and combining things. And I think that this is like what Mania was showing in her presentation as well. It's just starting to emerge that we're having the tools to really kind of build models of real structural systems and start relating what could be form with things that could actually work. And the moment that this kind of accumulation of knowledge and material starts getting online and a bigger community starts kind of making that available, I think that we can get up to speed to some of the people in visual arts that are kind of definitely have already kind of a big block of people thinking and developing, I think. So I think that we should really push for that, and the idea of putting this content and sharing this content is really crucial for this. What I think that should be still kind of an ongoing curve for architecture, but maybe it's different with some of the other guys that are just already moving faster.
Just to add to that, I think one of the big limiting factors within architecture, though, is the idea of accountability. And if you do make an open source library when somebody builds a building based upon it, people worry about what happens when that thing falls down. And it's a very real issue that people have to think about. But at the same time, I don't think that should be something that hinders us. It's just a challenge for how we actually overcome it. Because, I mean, if you make a fluid library and it fails, nobody dies, nobody drowns in virtual fluid. But that's not necessarily true of real architecture.
I do actually say do not use this library for actual simulation. I just want to add, my sister's an architect, so we have these chats a lot. And one thing that I do envy about, say, the architecture world, which is exactly because of what you said, you have the accountability, things are done properly. Whereas, at least in the commercial world, people don't actually care. So, you know, if it's held together with blue tack and sticky tape, so be it. If there's a deadline on that day and something's being launched, just do something, even if behind the scenes there's a guy with whatever. So we don't get time to do proper R&D, and as the projects scale, you know, we can't afford to do our own R&D because we need, you know, say, really complicated stuff. So we just did a project I didn't really show, but I skipped through it. I would have loved to done like months work of R&D on the materials, and obviously you guys, you do loads of R&D because someone could die. So that's something that I hope the commercial world can learn from, you know, I would say the blue world. The way to do things properly is something that is really lacking, so I'd say the grass is green on the other side of the hill, really.
Room for maybe one final question before we pick this up?
Well, I just really wondered about your creative processes to do with the different facets of the work. For instance, the visual aesthetic, the sound, or even the mechanics and how they work. And I just wondered how you sort of go between those three things when you're sculpting something towards something you're happy with. Like, do you get the look right first, or do you get the way it works right first, or how you work through that?
I'd say, I mean, we often try to drive the multiple outlets from the same simulation or from the same system. And I think the first thing you would try to get right is the mechanics. If you're working with the simulations, and if you have a debug view and it's just a couple of red dots on a grey background, and it already begins to look alive and feel dynamic, then you can make it look whatever you want. It's always going to work. I think if you did it the other way around, it would be a bit dangerous. Because then I think and that might be the classical approach that would be coming from animation, where you do style frames and storyboards, and then you imagine the bits between the keyframes. And I think the danger would be if you wanted to achieve a system that you can almost leave alone, let people interact with it, or have live data imports or something else, then you just don't know how it's going to end up looking. So building it up the other way around, I think.
Yeah, for me it's pretty much the same. Personally, I'm into behaviors, so I always try to get the movement and the behavior nailed first, and the aesthetic usually comes during that process. And it depends on the project. Sometimes sound comes first, sometimes sound comes last. But always behavior and movements, for me, personally, is just the really important aspect.
Maybe one more thing about the correlation of sound and visuals. We've often, in earlier projects, had sound coming last and then kind of building something that works with the system as well, or creating a soundtrack. And then we've moved on to having it driven from the same simulation. And we're actually moving one step further at the moment in a couple of projects that we're working on, where rhythm and kind of metaphors of rhythm and tact and impulses, kind of musical patterns, drive the visuals, and they're kind of there first as an idea and as a narrative structure. And I think that's where it gets really interesting for us, because we're essentially visual people, but we're kind of tapping into a different world, and we're giving it a little bit of control over what we do.
Thanks again for the speakers for coming today, and everybody that stayed. So we'll see you guys. The next Nexus is going to be in May, because April is closed here in Bartlett. We have a great lecture on Friday as well, so join us for that. Giuseppe Longo is here, so just come around if you're interested. Thank you again.